The train lurched to a stop in Silver Creek, Colorado territory, and Catherine Moore pressed her gloved hand against the dusty window, searching desperately for the man who had promised her wealth, security, and a future far removed from the Boston tenements where she had scrubbed floors until her knuckles bled. It was June of 1878, and the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden platform where a handful of weathered men stood waiting, none of them wearing the fine suit she had imagined adorning her prospective husband. Catherine smoothed the front of her traveling dress, the nicest garment she owned, purchased with the last of her savings because she wanted to make a good impression on Mr. James Thornton, the man whose letters had painted pictures of vast cattle ranches, a sprawling home with multiple bedrooms, and opportunities that stretched as wide as the Colorado sky. His words had been eloquent, his promises grand, and most importantly, his descriptions of his wealth had been specific enough to convince her that leaving behind everything familiar was worth the risk. She stepped down from the train car, her single trunk carried behind her by a porter who set it on the platform with a thud that seemed to echo her suddenly uncertain heartbeat. The men standing nearby tipped their hats politely, but none approached her directly. Catherine scanned their faces again, looking for someone who matched the description James had provided, a tall man with dark hair and a commanding presence who would be wearing his best clothes to greet his bride. "Miss Moore." The voice came from behind her, rough and uncertain. Catherine turned and found herself face to face with a cowboy who could not have been more than 25 years old, only a few years older than her own 22. He was tall, as promised, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, but there the resemblance to her imagination ended. His clothes were clean but worn, his shirt patched at one elbow, his boots scuffed from hard use. Dust clung to his denim pants, and his hat looked like it had seen better days several years ago. His face was handsome in a weathered way, with strong features and eyes the color of honey that regarded her with something between hope and dread. "I am Catherine Moore," she said carefully, her stomach sinking. "Are you here on behalf of Mr. James Thornton?" The cowboy removed his hat and held it against his chest, revealing more of his sun-bronzed face. "I am James Thornton, Miss Moore. I am real sorry about the confusion." Catherine felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. This could not be the man who had written about vast holdings and prosperity. This was clearly a working ranch hand, someone who lived day to day on wages, not someone who owned anything of value. She had crossed half a continent based on lies, and now she stood in a dusty town in the middle of nowhere with no money to return home and no prospects beyond the deception standing before her. "I see," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic and anger. "Your letters mentioned considerable wealth, Mr. Thornton. They described a large ranch house and substantial cattle holdings." James's face flushed, and he looked down at his hat, turning it slowly in his calloused hands. "I know what I wrote, Miss Moore, and I need to explain. Can we talk somewhere more private? The hotel has a sitting room, and I will buy you lunch while I tell you the truth. After that, if you want to take the next train back east, I will pay for your ticket. I know I have not been entirely honest, and you have every right to be angry." Catherine wanted to scream at him right there on the platform, but years of maintaining dignity, even in the worst circumstances, kept her composed. She nodded stiffly, and James picked up her trunk as though it weighed nothing, leading her down the dusty main street toward a wooden building with a faded sign reading Silver Creek Hotel. The sitting room was modest but clean, with several chairs arranged near windows that looked out onto the street. James set her trunk down and gestured for her to sit, before disappearing briefly to order food. Catherine perched on the edge of a chair, her back straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she tried to figure out what she would do next. She had no family in Boston anymore. Her parents dead from illness 3 years ago, her younger sister married and moved to Philadelphia. The work available to unmarried women without connections meant poverty and endless toil, which was precisely why she had answered James Thornton's advertisement in the first place. James returned with a tray bearing sandwiches, coffee, and slices of apple pie. He set it down on the small table between them and took the chair across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his expression earnest and miserable. "I am not a rich man, Miss Moore," he began without preamble. "I do not own a big ranch house or vast herds of cattle. What I own is a small piece of land about 5 miles outside of town, 40 acres that I have been working for 3 years since I bought it with money I saved from cowboying. I have a cabin, 1 room with a loft, and I have been building it bigger bit by bit as I can afford lumber. I own 12 head of cattle right now, and I am working for the Double R Ranch to earn money while I build up my own herd." Catherine stared at him, her anger building with each word. "So everything you wrote was a lie?" "Not everything," James said quickly, then caught himself. "But yes, I lied about my circumstances, and I am sorrier than I can say. I know that does not excuse it. I just thought that if I told the truth, no woman would be willing to come out here and take a chance on a man who is just starting out. I have been alone for so long, working sunrise to sunset with nothing but my horse and my dreams for company. I wanted a wife, a partner, someone to build a life with. I know I went about it all wrong." "You certainly did," Catherine said coldly, though her anger was tempered slightly by the genuine remorse in his voice. "What did you think would happen when I arrived and discovered the truth? Did you imagine I would simply accept the deception and be grateful for whatever you offered?" James shook his head. "I honestly did not think that far ahead, which I know makes me a fool. I just kept hoping that maybe if you met me first, if we had a chance to talk, you might be willing to see past what I do not have and consider what I could offer." "And what exactly can you offer me?" Catherine demanded. "Poverty, a 1-room cabin, years of struggle with no guarantee of success." James met her eyes directly, and she saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch despite her fury. It was not arrogance or manipulation, but rather a raw honesty that she had rarely encountered in her life. "I cannot offer you wealth or luxury, Miss Moore. I cannot promise you an easy life or comfort right away. What I can offer you is devotion like you have never known. I can promise that I will work harder than any man alive to build something good for us. I can give you honesty from this moment forward, no more lies or exaggerations. I can offer you a partnership where we face whatever comes together, and I can swear that I will treasure you every single day for the rest of my life. I am wealthy only in devotion, and if that is not enough, I understand completely." Catherine looked away, blinking rapidly against the sudden sting of tears. She did not want to be moved by his words, did not want to feel anything but righteous anger at his deception. But there was something in his voice, in the way he spoke with such conviction, that touched a place deep inside her that she had thought long dead after years of disappointment and hardship. "That is quite a speech, Mr. Thornton," she said quietly. "But devotion does not put food on the table or a roof over one's head." "No, it does not," James agreed. "But hard work does, and I have plenty of that to give. I am not asking you to decide right now. Stay a few days at the hotel, my expense, and let me show you what I am building. Let me introduce you to the town and the people. If after 3 days you want to leave, I will pay your way back east with enough money to get you started somewhere new. But if you are willing to take a chance on me, on us, I promise I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it." Catherine finally looked at him again, studying his face carefully. He was handsome, she could not deny that, with strong features and eyes that seemed incapable of hiding what he felt. His hands were rough with work, his body lean and strong from physical labor. He was not what she had expected or what she had planned for, but perhaps life had taught her enough times that plans rarely worked out as anticipated. 3 days, she said finally. "But I make no promises beyond that, Mr. Thornton, and you will address me as Miss Moore until I decide otherwise." Relief flooded James's face, transforming it completely. "Thank you, Miss Moore. You will not regret giving me this chance, I swear it. He left her to eat in peace, paying for her room before departing to return to his work at the Double R Ranch. Catherine sat alone in the sitting room long after finishing her meal, staring out the window at the unfamiliar town and wondering if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life, or somehow stumbled into an unexpected opportunity. The next morning, James arrived at the hotel just after dawn, freshly washed and wearing what were clearly his best clothes, though they were still simple and well-worn. Catherine had dressed carefully in her second-best dress, saving her traveling outfit for when she might need to make another journey. She was not sure what to expect from the day, but she had decided that if she was going to spend 3 days here, she might as well learn everything she could about the situation she had walked into. James helped her up onto the seat of a simple wagon pulled by 2 sturdy horses. "I thought I would show you the land first, if that is all right with you, Miss Moore. I want you to see what I am building, what I hope we might build together if you are willing." Catherine nodded, and they set off down the main street and out onto a dirt road that wound through rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and wildflowers. The morning air was cool and fresh, not yet bearing the heat that would come later in the day. Birds sang in the distance, and the sky stretched endlessly blue above them. "I came out here 4 years ago," James said as they rode, his voice easy and conversational. "I was 19 and full of dreams about making something of myself. I had been cowboying since I was 15, after my parents died of fever back in Missouri. I worked for different ranches, saved every penny I could, and learned everything about cattle and horses and surviving out here. 3 years ago, I had enough money to buy this land from a man who was heading back east after his wife died. He sold it to me cheap because he just wanted to be gone." "That must have been difficult," Catherine said, feeling a reluctant sympathy for the unknown man who had lost so much. "It was his heartbreak that gave me my chance," James acknowledged. "I have tried to honor that by making something good here, something that would last. The cabin was already standing, just barely, and I have been improving it whenever I have time and materials. The land is good, with a creek running through it and enough grass for cattle. I work at the Double R Ranch most days, earning wages and learning from Mr. Richardson, who owns it. He is a good man, fair and honest, and he has been teaching me the business side of ranching, not just the labor." They crested a hill, and James pulled the wagon to a stop, gesturing ahead. "There it is, Miss Moore. That is my land, my home, my future." Catherine looked where he indicated and saw a small cabin nestled in a valley with a line of cottonwood trees marking where the creek must run. The cabin was rough but appeared solid, with smoke rising from a chimney. Beyond it, she could see a small corral with several horses and a field where cattle grazed peacefully. It was modest, even primitive by the standards she had grown up with, but there was something appealing about the way it sat in the landscape, as though it belonged there. "It is not much," James said quietly, watching her face for a reaction. "But it is mine, earned with my own sweat and sacrifice. And it could be yours too, if you wanted it to be." Catherine did not answer immediately, still taking in the scene before her. She had expected to feel disappointment or dismay, and there was some of that, but there was also something unexpected. Looking at that little cabin and the land around it, she felt a strange stirring of possibility, as though she could see not just what was there, but what could be with time and effort. "Tell me about your plans," she said. "If everything went as you hoped, what would this place look like in 5 years? In 10, James's face lit up with enthusiasm, and he began talking eagerly about his dreams. He described expanding the cabin into a proper house with multiple rooms, building up his herd to 50 or 60 head of cattle, maybe adding some horses to breed and sell. He talked about eventually having enough success that he would not need to work for someone else, that he could focus entirely on his own ranch. He mentioned wanting children someday, a family to pass the land on to, and traditions they could build together. As he spoke, Catherine found herself caught up in his vision despite her reservations. There was something infectious about his hope, his determination. She had spent so many years simply surviving, focusing only on getting through each day, that she had forgotten what it felt like to dream about the future. "What about you, Miss Moore?" James asked, turning to look at her directly. "What are your dreams? What do you want from life?" Catherine hesitated, unused to being asked such questions. "I want security," she said slowly. "I want to never wonder where my next meal is coming from or whether I will have a roof over my head. I want to matter to someone, to be more than just a pair of hands to scrub floors or mend clothes. I want a home, a real home, not just a room in a boarding house or a corner in someone else's space." "Those are good dreams," James said softly. "Those are dreams I can help make real if you let me." They drove down to the cabin, and James showed her around with obvious pride despite the humble nature of everything. The cabin was indeed one room with a sleeping loft reached by a ladder, but it was clean and well maintained. He had built the furniture himself, simple but sturdy pieces that served their purpose. There was a cook stove that looked relatively new, and shelves held supplies and a few books. Through the window, Catherine could see the creek sparkling in the sunlight. "I have been working on an addition," James said, leading her around to the side of the cabin where fresh lumber was stacked and the beginning of a new wall frame was visible. "This will be a bedroom, a proper one, and then I will add a larger main room so the cabin becomes just the kitchen and sleeping area. It goes slowly because I can only afford to buy materials bit by bit, but I work on it every spare moment I have." Catherine examined the construction and could see that, while rough, it was solid work. James clearly knew what he was doing, and he took pride in doing it well. She walked to the creek, and he followed at a respectful distance, giving her space to think. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, and wildflowers grew along the banks in cheerful profusion. Catherine knelt and trailed her fingers through the water, closing her eyes and trying to imagine living here, waking to this view every morning, building a life in this isolated place with a man she barely knew. "It is beautiful," she admitted, opening her eyes and looking up at James. "Lonely, I imagine, but beautiful." "It has been lonely," James said honestly. "That is part of why I wrote those letters, why I wanted a wife so badly that I was foolish enough to lie. I am not proud of that, Miss Moore. It will always be something I regret, no matter what happens. But I am grateful you are willing to at least consider this. Consider me, even after knowing the truth." They spent the rest of the morning at the property, with James showing her the cattle, explaining his plans for expanding the herd, and talking about the challenges of ranching in Colorado territory. Catherine found herself asking questions, engaging with the information in a way that surprised her. She had never thought about cattle or ranching before, but there was something intriguing about learning how it all worked, understanding the rhythms and demands of this life. In the afternoon, James drove her back to town and gave her a tour, introducing her to the shopkeepers and residents they encountered. Silver Creek was small but had the essential businesses: a general store, a blacksmith, a doctor, a church, and a handful of other establishments. The people they met were friendly and curious, clearly interested in the newcomer who might become James Thornton's wife. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store with her husband, was particularly welcoming. She was a plump, cheerful woman in her 50s who immediately took Catherine under her wing, insisting she come for tea the next day so they could get properly acquainted. Catherine appreciated the gesture, knowing that if she did decide to stay, having female friends in town would make all the difference. That evening, James walked Catherine back to the hotel as the sun set in a spectacular display of orange and gold across the western sky. They stood outside the hotel entrance, the street quiet around them, and James held his hat in his hands the same way he had that first day. "Thank you for today, Miss Moore," he said sincerely. "I hope it helped you understand what I am offering, even if it is not what you expected." "It did," Catherine replied. "I still have much to think about, Mr. Thornton, but I appreciate your honesty today. That means more than you might realize." James nodded, his eyes warm as he looked at her. "I will come by tomorrow morning if that is all right. I thought maybe we could attend church together, let folks see us as a potential couple, and then perhaps have a picnic lunch out by Miller's Pond. It is a nice spot, peaceful, and we could talk more." "That would be acceptable," Catherine said, and she was surprised to realize she meant it. She was actually looking forward to spending more time with James, to learning more about him and this life he was building. The second day began with church services, and Catherine found herself seated beside James in a pew halfway back in the small wooden building that served as Silver Creek's house of worship. The congregation was modest but welcoming, and she could feel curious eyes on her throughout the service. James sang the hymns in a pleasant baritone, and when the collection plate came around, he contributed coins that she suspected represented a significant portion of his weekly wages. After the service, they were surrounded by people eager to meet the potential new resident. Catherine answered questions graciously, explaining that she was from Boston and was considering staying in Silver Creek. She noticed how the community seemed to genuinely like and respect James, how they spoke to him as an equal despite his modest circumstances. Mr. Richardson, the owner of the Double R Ranch, even made a point of coming over to introduce himself. "James is one of the finest cowboys I have ever employed," Mr. Richardson said, a tall man in his 60s with a weathered face and kind eyes. "He is honest, hard-working, and smart. If he is building his own place, I have no doubt he will succeed. Any woman would be fortunate to have him as a husband." Catherine thanked him for the information, filing it away as another piece of the puzzle she was trying to solve. Everything she learned about James Thornton confirmed that he was exactly what he claimed to be, a decent man working hard to build a future. The question was whether she could see herself as part of that future. The picnic at Miller's Pond was lovely, with food James had clearly taken care to prepare himself. They sat on a blanket beneath a large willow tree, eating cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, and the cookies Mrs. Henderson had insisted on contributing when she learned of their plans. The pond was calm and blue, reflecting the sky like a mirror, and dragonflies darted across its surface. "Tell me about Boston," James said as they ate. "What was your life like there?" Catherine found herself talking more freely than she had expected, describing her childhood in a working-class neighborhood, her parents' deaths, the years of hard labor that followed. She spoke about the loneliness of being unmarried in a society that valued women primarily for their domestic roles, about the limited options available to someone in her position. James listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and responding with genuine sympathy. "It sounds like you have already known hardship," he said quietly. "I hate that my deception might have added to that burden. You deserve better, Miss Moore." "Perhaps," Catherine said, "but life rarely gives us what we deserve, good or bad. It just gives us what comes, and we have to decide how to respond." "That is a wise way of looking at things," James observed. "Is that how you are approaching this situation, deciding how to respond to what has come your way?" Catherine smiled slightly. "I suppose it is. 3 days ago, I thought I knew exactly what my future held. Now everything has changed, and I am trying to figure out which path leads to the life I actually want, not just the life I thought I was supposed to want." James leaned back on his elbows, looking up at the sky through the willow branches. "Can I tell you something, Miss Moore? When I wrote those letters, when I lied about my circumstances, I thought wealth was what mattered. I thought a woman would not want me unless I could promise her comfort and security. But meeting you, talking with you, I realized that what matters is something deeper. It is about two people choosing to build something together, about partnership and respect and devotion. Those things cannot be bought, but they can be given freely if both people are willing." Catherine felt her heart beat faster at his words, at the sincerity in his voice. She was beginning to understand that James Thornton might not have material wealth, but he had an emotional richness that she had never encountered before. He spoke about feelings and commitment with an openness that was startling and appealing. "You speak very easily about devotion," she said carefully. "But we barely know each other. How can you promise such things to a stranger?" James sat up and turned to face her fully. "You are right that we are still strangers in many ways, but I feel like I can see who you are, Miss Moore. I can see your strength in how you crossed the country alone on the word of a man you had never met. I can see your resilience in the stories you have told about surviving after your parents died. I can see your honesty in how you confronted me about my lies instead of just leaving. Those are the qualities that matter, and those are what I am offering my devotion to, not some imagined idea of who you might be." Catherine found she had no response to that, her throat tight with unexpected emotion. She looked away, blinking rapidly, and James respectfully gave her space, beginning to pack up the picnic things. They spent the afternoon walking around the pond, talking about lighter topics, books they had read, places they had seen, dreams they had harbored as children. It was easy and comfortable in a way Catherine had not anticipated, and by the time they returned to town, she realized she was genuinely enjoying James's company. The third day arrived too quickly, bringing with it the decision Catherine had been avoiding. She woke early in her hotel room and sat by the window, watching the town come to life as merchants opened their shops and people began their daily routines. She had promised James 3 days, and those days were up. Now she had to choose whether to stay or return east. The practical part of her mind listed all the reasons to leave. James was poor, the life would be hard, the cabin was barely adequate, and she would be isolated from everything familiar. But another part of her, a part she had thought died years ago under the weight of disappointment and struggle, whispered different truths. James was honest, kind, hardworking, and devoted. The life would be challenging but held the possibility of real partnership and meaning. The cabin was small but could be expanded. The isolation might become intimacy. James arrived mid-morning and Catherine could see the tension in his shoulders, the anxiety in his eyes. He knew this was decision day, and his entire future hung on what she would say. They walked together to a small park at the edge of town, neither speaking until they reached a bench beneath a large oak tree. "I will not draw this out," Catherine said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I have made my decision." James nodded, his hands clenched together, his jaw tight. "I will stay," Catherine continued and watched as shock and joy flooded James's face. "But I have conditions. We will wait 1 month before marrying, during which time we will continue to get to know each other. If either of us has doubts during that time, we will be honest about them. You will continue to be truthful with me about everything, your finances, your plans, your feelings, and we will be true partners, making decisions together about our life and our future." "Yes," James said immediately, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes to all of that, Miss Moore. Thank you for giving me this chance, giving us this chance. I swear I will never give you reason to regret it." Catherine smiled, feeling a weight lift from her chest that she had not realized she was carrying. "Then perhaps you could call me Catherine, at least when we are alone. I think we can move past such formality given the circumstances." "Catherine," James repeated, as though testing how her name felt in his mouth. "That is a beautiful name, and you can call me James, please." They spent the rest of that day making practical plans. Catherine would continue staying at the hotel for the next month, with James visiting daily. He would continue working at the Double R Ranch and on his property, but they would spend their evenings together, eating dinner at the hotel restaurant or taking walks around town. On Sundays, they would visit his property together so Catherine could learn more about ranching and begin to see herself as part of that life. The month that followed was unlike anything Catherine had ever experienced. James courted her with a combination of determined romance and practical planning that she found utterly charming. He brought her wildflowers picked from the meadows near his cabin, and he also taught her how to ride a horse so she could move around the ranch independently. He wrote her short notes expressing his feelings, and he also discussed with her the financial realities of their situation, so she understood exactly what life would entail. Mrs. Henderson became a good friend, teaching Catherine about cooking for ranch life and sharing stories about her own early days in Colorado Territory. Through her, Catherine met other women in town and began to build a support network that would be essential for the isolated life ahead. She learned which plants were edible and which were poisonous, how to preserve food for winter, and the 100 other small skills that would make the difference between thriving and merely surviving. James, for his part, worked like a man possessed. He spent every spare moment on the cabin addition, determined to have a proper bedroom finished before their wedding. Mr. Richardson, upon learning of the engagement, gifted them a beautiful bed frame he had stored in his barn, and several of the cowboys from the Double R Ranch spent a Sunday helping James with the construction, speeding the process considerably. As the weeks passed, Catherine found herself falling in love in a way she had not thought possible. It was not the dramatic, sweeping romance of novels, but rather a steady deepening of affection and respect. She loved how James's face lit up when he saw her, how he listened intently when she spoke, how he never made her feel foolish for asking questions about ranching or expressing concerns about their future. She loved his work ethic, his integrity, and the gentle way he treated the animals in his care. Most of all, she loved how safe she felt with him, as though she had finally found a place where she truly belonged. James fell just as deeply, marveling daily at his good fortune that Catherine had decided to stay. He loved her intelligence, her quiet strength, and the way she approached every new challenge with determination rather than complaint. He loved her laugh, rare but genuine, and the way she hummed softly to herself when she was concentrating on a task. He loved that she asked hard questions about their finances and future rather than just accepting his assurances, because it showed she was invested in building a real partnership. The month passed quickly, and before either of them quite believed it possible, their wedding day arrived. It was a simple ceremony held in the town church on a beautiful afternoon in late July, with most of Silver Creek in attendance. Catherine wore a dress Mrs. Henderson and the other town women had helped her make, a beautiful creation in cream-colored fabric that made her look like something from a dream. James wore new clothes purchased specifically for the occasion, the first time in years he had owned anything that was not second-hand or work-worn. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony, speaking about partnership, commitment, and the building of a life together through dedication and love. When James said his vows, his voice was strong and clear, promising to cherish Catherine all the days of his life, to be her partner in all things, and to build with her a future worthy of their devotion. Catherine's voice shook slightly with emotion as she made her own promises, pledging her loyalty, her partnership, and her heart to the man who had proven himself worthy of all three. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed Catherine with such tenderness that several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The celebration that followed was joyous, with food contributed by half the town, fiddle music, and dancing that went on until well after sunset. Catherine had never felt so welcomed, so much a part of a community, and she realized that she had found not just a husband but a home in the truest sense of the word. As night fell, James drove them back to the cabin in the wagon, now decorated with ribbons and flowers thanks to the mischief of some of the younger townspeople. The stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by any competing light, and the air was cool and fresh. Catherine leaned against James's shoulder, feeling a contentment she had never known before. The cabin looked different when they arrived, and Catherine realized that someone, probably Mrs. Henderson and her conspirators, had been there ahead of them. Candles glowed in the windows and flowers decorated the doorway. Inside, the new bedroom had been prepared with fresh linens on the bed, more candles, and a bottle of wine with 2 glasses waiting on the small table James had built. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thornton," James said softly, lifting Catherine over the threshold with surprising ease. "Welcome home, Mr. Thornton," Catherine replied, smiling up at him. Their wedding night was tender and unhurried, a gentle exploration of new intimacy. James was patient and careful, making sure Catherine felt safe and cherished every moment. They talked quietly in the darkness afterward, lying close together in their new bed, making plans and sharing hopes for the future that stretched ahead of them. The first months of marriage were an adjustment as they learned to live together, to navigate the daily realities of sharing space and making decisions as a unit. Catherine took to ranch life with determined energy, learning to cook on the wood stove, to tend the vegetable garden James had started, to help with the cattle when an extra pair of hands was needed. It was hard work, harder than anything she had done in Boston, but it was work that meant something, that built toward a future rather than just surviving the present. James continued working at the Double R Ranch 3 days a week, bringing home wages that they carefully saved and budgeted. The other days he worked on their own property, and Catherine worked beside him whenever possible. Together they expanded the cabin further, adding not just the bedroom but a proper sitting room and a larger kitchen. They built a chicken coop and acquired 6 hens that provided fresh eggs. They added to their cattle herd gradually, purchasing 2 pregnant cows that would calve in the spring. Winter came with stunning cold and snow that piled high around the cabin. Catherine learned what isolation truly meant as days passed, when they could not even make it to town due to the weather. But she also learned the coziness of being snowed in with someone you loved, of spending long evenings by the fire reading aloud to each other, of waking warm beneath heavy quilts while wind howled outside. James proved true to every promise he had made. His devotion never wavered, even when Catherine was frustrated with the difficulties of their life or when money was particularly tight. He treated her as a true partner, discussing every decision with her and valuing her opinion on matters large and small. When she suggested they use part of their savings to buy fruit trees to plant around the cabin, he immediately agreed, seeing the wisdom in her long-term thinking. Spring arrived with a rush of green and the birth of 2 healthy calves that brought their herd to 16 head. Catherine discovered she was pregnant in April, and James's joy at the news was so profound that he actually wept, holding her close and thanking her over and over for the gift of family. They began planning for the baby immediately, with James starting work on a cradle and Catherine beginning to sew tiny clothes with fabric Mrs. Henderson helped her select. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into the fall. Catherine remained active as long as she could, still helping with ranch work and maintaining their home. James became almost comically protective, worrying about her constantly and trying to prevent her from doing any heavy labor. They argued about it good-naturedly, with Catherine insisting she was pregnant, not fragile, and James countering that their child was too precious to take any chances. In November of 1879, during the first snowstorm of the season, Catherine went into labor. James rode through the storm to fetch Doc Miller from town, and several hours later their son was born, a healthy baby boy with a lusty cry and his father's dark hair. They named him Samuel James Thornton, and James held his son with shaking hands and tears streaming down his face, marveling at the tiny life they had created together. Mrs. Henderson and 2 other women from town stayed for the first week, helping Catherine recover and teaching her about caring for an infant. James was a devoted father from the first moment, getting up with Catherine during the night feedings, changing diapers without complaint, and spending hours simply holding his son and talking to him softly about the ranch and the future they would build together. Life settled into a new rhythm with baby Samuel as part of their household. Catherine managed the home and baby while James worked, but they carved out time every day to be together as a family. James would come in from the fields and immediately take Samuel, walking around the cabin singing old cowboy songs while Catherine prepared dinner. In the evenings, they would sit together, Catherine often sewing or knitting while James whittled toys for Samuel or worked on tack that needed repair. The years began to pass, each bringing new challenges and joys. Their herd continued to grow slowly but steadily, and by 1882 they had 35 head of cattle and no longer needed James to work for the Double R Ranch. He was able to focus entirely on their own property, though he remained close friends with Mr. Richardson and sometimes helped out during particularly busy times like roundup or branding. A second child arrived in 1883, a daughter they named Eleanor Grace. She had Catherine's lighter coloring and a sweet disposition that contrasted with Samuel's energetic curiosity. James adored both his children equally, spending as much time with them as his work allowed and making sure they knew they were loved every single day. Catherine had never imagined she could be this happy. The life she had built with James was everything she had never dared to hope for, a true partnership based on mutual respect, deep affection, and shared goals. Yes, money was sometimes tight, and yes, the work was often exhausting, but those challenges were faced together, making them somehow more bearable. She had a home that was truly hers, children who brought immense joy, and a husband whose devotion had never wavered from the promise he made that first day. James felt similarly blessed, often pausing in his work to look at the life he had built and feeling overwhelmed with gratitude. The scared, lonely cowboy who had written those desperate, deceptive letters was gone, replaced by a confident rancher, husband and father who had proven that devotion and hard work could indeed build something lasting and beautiful. Every time he looked at Catherine, he thanked whatever providence had brought her to him and given him the chance to prove himself worthy of her trust. By 1885, the ranch was profitable enough that they could afford small luxuries they had never dreamed of in those early years. James built Catherine a proper springhouse for keeping food cool, and he surprised her with a sewing machine ordered from a catalog that made her cry with happiness. They added 2 more rooms to the cabin, giving the children their own bedroom and creating a dedicated dining area. The fruit trees Catherine had insisted on planting years ago were now producing apples and pears that she preserved for winter and shared with neighbors. Their herd had grown to 60 head, and they were considered successful ranchers by the standards of their community. James still did most of the physical labor himself, occasionally hiring help during the busiest seasons, but he took pride in being a hands-on owner who knew every animal and every inch of his property. Catherine managed the household accounts, negotiated prices when they sold cattle, and handled the business correspondence, proving herself just as capable in her role as James was in his. A third child, another son they named Thomas William, arrived in 1886, completing their family. Catherine was 30 years old now, James 33, and they felt deeply content with their 3 healthy children and thriving ranch. Samuel was 7 and already helping his father with small tasks around the property. Eleanor was 3, sweet and loving, always picking flowers and making up songs. Thomas was a cheerful baby who seemed determined to keep up with his older siblings from the start. The town of Silver Creek had grown over the years, gaining new businesses and residents, but it remained the tight-knit community that had welcomed Catherine all those years ago. Mrs. Henderson was still a close friend, now in her 60s and slowing down but still the heart of the community's social life. The Thorntons were respected members of the town, known for their integrity, hard work, and willingness to help neighbors in need. One evening in the summer of 1887, James and Catherine sat on the porch they had finally built onto the front of the cabin, which had expanded so much it could now truly be called a house. The children were asleep inside, and the night was peaceful except for the songs of crickets and the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance. "Do you remember when you first arrived?" James asked, reaching over to take Catherine's hand. "Do you remember how angry you were?" Catherine laughed softly. I remember thinking my life was over, that I had made the worst mistake possible in coming here. And now, James prompted, squeezing her hand gently, now I know that stepping off that train was the best decision I ever made, Catherine said honestly. You told me you were wealthy only in devotion, James, and at the time I thought that was just pretty words trying to cover up deception. But you have proven every day for 9 years that you meant exactly what you said. Your devotion has built all of this. She gestured to the house, the land, the life surrounding them. Not just the physical structures, but the love, the family, the partnership. You were right that day. Devotion is its own kind of wealth, maybe the truest kind. James felt his throat tighten with emotion. I have never stopped being grateful that you gave me a chance, that you saw past my stupid lies to the man I was trying to be. Everything good in my life comes from you saying yes that day, from choosing to stay. We built this together, Catherine corrected gently. Your devotion and my willingness to trust again after being disappointed. Your hard work and my determination to make this life succeed. Neither of us could have done this alone. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands clasped, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Inside, one of the children stirred and made a small noise before settling back to sleep. James smiled at the sound, still amazed years later that these were his children, this was his home, this was his life. I want to add more land, James said eventually. The property to our north is coming available, another 40 acres. With 90 total, we could really expand the herd, maybe build a proper barn, set up for the long term so that when Samuel is grown, he has something substantial to either take over or use to start his own place. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. We would need to take out a loan. Can we afford that? I think so, James said. I have been talking to the bank and our reputation is solid enough that they are willing to work with us. It would be tight for a few years, but I believe we could make it work. What do you think? I think you have never steered us wrong, Catherine said. If you believe we can do this, then we will find a way, we always have. They did purchase the land, taking out their first significant loan and spending the next several years working harder than ever to make it profitable. But the gamble paid off, and by the early 1890s, the Thornton Ranch was one of the most successful in the region. They built the barn James had dreamed of, large enough to house horses and store hay and equipment. They expanded the cattle herd to over 100 head, hiring 2 permanent ranch hands to help manage the increased workload. Samuel grew into a capable young man who loved ranching as much as his father did, working alongside James every day and learning the business from the ground up. Eleanor proved to have a head for numbers and took over much of the bookkeeping as she got older, working with Catherine to manage the financial side of the operation. Thomas, the youngest, loved the horses and showed a gift for training them, developing that side of the ranch business. As the children grew, the house grew with them, expanded and improved until it bore little resemblance to the tiny cabin Catherine had first seen all those years ago. There were 6 bedrooms now, a large kitchen with a modern stove, a proper dining room, and even a parlor for receiving guests. The land was dotted with outbuildings, the barn, equipment sheds, the chicken coop, and a bunkhouse for the hired hands. In 1895, James and Catherine celebrated their 17th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their 3 children, now aged 16, 12, and 9, and several close friends from town. Mrs. Henderson, now in her 70s but still spry, raised a toast to the couple who had built such a wonderful life from such an uncertain beginning. I remember when you arrived, Catherine, she said, her voice carrying across the gathering. I remember James coming to me in a panic, certain you would leave on the next train. And I told him then what I knew to be true, that any woman with sense would see the quality of his character beneath the poverty of his circumstances. You proved me right, my dear, and look what you have built together. Catherine smiled, leaning against James's shoulder as she had that night so long ago driving back from their wedding. I almost did leave, she admitted. "I was so angry and felt so betrayed." But James said something that day that I have never forgotten. He said he was wealthy only in devotion. At the time, I did not understand what that meant, but I have learned over the years that it meant everything. Devotion, true devotion, is worth more than any amount of gold or cattle or land. It is the foundation everything else is built on. James kissed the top of her head, his arm tight around her shoulders, and you gave me the chance to prove it. That is the real gift, Catherine. You could have left, should have left after I lied to you, but you stayed and gave me the opportunity to show you who I truly was. Everything we have is because you took that chance on me. The party continued into the evening, with music and dancing and laughter that echoed across the ranch. Samuel danced with a young woman from town he had been courting, and Catherine whispered to James that they might be planning another wedding soon. Eleanor showed off her latest drawings, talented sketches of ranch life that her parents hoped she might develop further. Thomas demonstrated his trick-riding skills, making everyone gasp and laugh at his daring. As the stars came out and the party began to wind down, James and Catherine stood together looking out at the land they had built their life on. The cattle were dark shapes in the pastures, the barn stood solid and strong, and the house glowed with lamplight and warmth. Children's laughter drifted from where Samuel was playing a game with his siblings and some of the younger guests. "Are you happy, Catherine?" James asked quietly. "Truly happy with how life has turned out." Catherine turned to look at her husband, taking in the lines that time and work had etched into his face, the silver beginning to thread through his dark hair, the strength still evident in his frame despite the passing years. He was still the handsomest man she had ever known, but more than that, he was the best man she had ever known. "I am happier than I ever imagined possible," she said honestly. "When I stepped off that train expecting to meet a wealthy rancher, I had no idea I was actually about to meet the richest man in Colorado. Not in money, though we have done well enough, but in all the things that truly matter. You have given me a life beyond my wildest dreams, James Thornton." "We gave it to each other," James corrected, just as she had years ago. "Your strength, my devotion, our partnership. That is what built this, Catherine. That is what will sustain it for years to come." They stood together in the gathering darkness, hands clasped as they always were, looking out at the legacy they had created through love, hard work, and unwavering devotion to each other and the life they had chosen to build together. The years continued to roll by with the steady rhythm of ranch life. Samuel did indeed marry his sweetheart, a lovely young woman named Alice from a neighboring ranch, and they built a home on the far corner of the Thornton property, expanding the family operation. Eleanor surprised everyone by deciding to attend Teachers College in Denver, supported wholeheartedly by her parents who wanted their children to follow their own paths. Thomas stayed on the ranch, developing the horse breeding program into a profitable enterprise of its own. James and Catherine grew older together, their love deepening with each passing season. They faced challenges, drought years that tested their reserves, an economic depression that made selling cattle difficult, the normal struggles of raising children and running a business. But they faced everything together, just as they had from the beginning, partners in the truest sense of the word. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1903, they renewed their vows in the same church where they had married, surrounded by their children, a growing number of grandchildren, and the community that had become their extended family. Samuel and Alice had given them 3 grandchildren already, with another on the way. Eleanor had returned from Denver with a teaching position in Silver Creek and a new husband, a fellow teacher who fit seamlessly into the family. Thomas had married as well, to a spirited young woman who loved horses as much as he did. Standing before Reverend Matthews, now quite elderly but insisting on performing the ceremony, James and Catherine repeated the vows they had made 25 years earlier. But this time there was no uncertainty, no fear, only the deep certainty of a love that had been tested and proven through decades of partnership. I, James Thornton, take you, Catherine Thornton, to continue as my wife, James said, his voice strong despite his 52 years. I promised you once that I was wealthy only in devotion, and I have spent 25 years proving that truth. I will spend the rest of my life continuing to prove it, cherishing you, honoring you, and thanking God every day that you took a chance on a poor cowboy with nothing to offer but his heart. Catherine's eyes shone with tears as she responded. I, Catherine Thornton, take you, James Thornton, to continue as my husband. You taught me what true wealth means, not in money or possessions, but in partnership, respect, and unwavering love. You have given me a life I never dreamed possible, and I will spend the rest of my days grateful that I stepped off that train in Silver Creek and found not the rich man I expected, but the devoted man I needed. The congregation erupted in applause, and their children and grandchildren surrounded them with hugs and congratulations. The celebration that followed was joyous, with the entire town joining in to honor the couple who had become pillars of the community. As evening fell and the party wound down, James and Catherine found themselves once again on their porch, the same spot where they had shared so many quiet moments over the years. The ranch spread out before them in the twilight, beautiful and prosperous, a testament to everything they had built together. You know, Catherine said thoughtfully, I sometimes wonder what my life would have been like if you had told the truth in those letters. If you had written about the tiny cabin and the small herd and the struggles you faced, would you have come? James asked, genuinely curious despite all the years that had passed. Catherine considered the question carefully. Honestly, probably not. I was looking for security, for the easy path, and I would have passed over your letter in search of someone who could promise me comfort without struggle. And you would have missed all this, James said, gesturing at the ranch, the life they had created. Exactly, Catherine agreed. I would have missed the great love of my life because I was too scared to take a risk on something real. So perhaps your lies, wrong as they were actually a strange sort of gift. They got me here, and once I was here, I was able to see past the poverty to the wealth that truly mattered. James pulled her close, and they watched the stars emerge, the same stars that had witnessed their journey from strangers to partners to the deeply devoted couple they had become. I love you, Catherine Thornton, James said simply. I have loved you from the moment you stepped off that train, even when you were furious with me. I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, James Thornton, Catherine replied. You promised me you were wealthy only in devotion, and you have made me the richest woman in the world. They sat together as night fell completely, hands clasped, hearts joined. Two people who had taken a chance on each other and built a life that exceeded every dream and expectation. The ranch would continue, passed down to their children and grandchildren, but more important than the land or cattle or buildings was the legacy of love and devotion they had created, a testament to the truth that real wealth is measured not in money, but in the depth of commitment two people can share. In the years that followed, James and Catherine continued to thrive, remaining active in ranch life well into their 60s and 70s. They delighted in their growing number of grandchildren, passing on stories and wisdom gained from decades of partnership. The ranch continued to prosper under Samuel's management, with Thomas's horses gaining regional fame and Alina's children showing interest in returning to help run the family operation. When James Thornton passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78 in 1929, he died as he had lived for more than 50 years, with Catherine's hand in his. His last words to her were the same promise he had made that first day they met, that he was wealthy only in devotion, and he had proven that truth every single day of their life together. Catherine lived another 5 years, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. She remained on the ranch until the end, still sharp and engaged with the operation that she and James had built from nothing but hope and hard work. When she passed in 1934 at the age of 76, she was buried beside her beloved husband on a hill overlooking the ranch. Their graves marked with a simple stone that read, James and Catherine Thornton, partners in life, united in love, wealthy in devotion. The ranch continued through the generations, each one adding to the legacy that had begun when a deceived mail-order bride decided to give a poor cowboy 3 days to prove his worth, and discovered in the process that true wealth had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the depth of devotion two people could share when they chose to build a life together.